Coal Conversations hosted by Alberta Wilderness Association. Thank you for joining us this snowy Saturday. It is heartening to see so many folks taking time out of their day to discuss this issue. My aim for the event is for it to be intimate, conversational, and empowering. I want everyone to come away with feeling that you got to know more, speak directly with experts, and ask the questions you care about, and can educate your friends and family on the issue. First, I'm going to present a general overview of key coal information, policies, events, projects, and research in Alberta to explain how we got here. Throughout the 60s and 70s, there's this growing public concern and debate on the impacts and damage that could result if coal exploration and development continued unrestricted in the foothills and Rockies, which are collectively known as the Eastern Slopes. Following some extensive public consultation, the Alberta government of the time responded with a coal development policy for Alberta. More commonly known as the 1976 Coal Policy, the document sought to strike a balance between resource development and environmental protection, dividing the eastern slopes into 4 categories that permitted varying levels of coal activity. In practice, this protected large swaths of Alberta's foothills and Rocky Mountain ecosystems from further development. Records list over 2,300 mines active throughout the first century of coal development in the province, although only around 50% would go on to produce any quantifiable amounts. In the last half century since the policy has been active, 97 mines have started, with only 42 going on to extract any coal. This is meaningful when considering the environmental costs and cumulative impacts of this industry. You will notice, however, that some of the category boundaries seem a little arbitrary, with pockets of land open for all kinds of exploration and development. These would be Category 4 lands, surrounded by areas where nothing is permitted, are Category 1 lands. It is not that these areas didn't contain just as important habitat or headwaters or as much biodiversity value or provision of ecological benefits as those surrounding areas. It's that they already contained existing leases or mines. Despite this, I want to emphasize that this policy was and is progressive in many ways. Take this quote, for instance. The government will weigh all significant direct and indirect benefits against all significant direct and indirect costs or adverse effects. Consideration will be given not only to those costs and benefits which are measurable in dollars, but also to the more subjective. I really appreciate this quote because I think it recognizes that we can't put a value on everything. We can't always balance something in a spreadsheet. There's no value we can put on clean air. There's no value we can put on clean water. It's also inclusive in a way that recognizes the costs and benefits we recognize now might not necessarily be the same costs and benefits we recognize as we have more information decades later on. I also appreciate that it says the government will weigh. This is in comparison to the policy we typically see today, which says the government may consider. May consider is language that is completely discretionary. It is language that allows the minister or the government of the time to decide what they believe is important to consider. Language like will weigh is a lot more binding. It is language you can hold the government accountable to. So that's the 1976 coal policy. Let's look at some of the impacts of coal mines that people were concerned about that brought this about in the first place. In the initial exploratory stages, the construction of roads and drill pads requires logging trees and removing vegetation. Other land uses and public access to Crown lands may be restricted to prioritize coal companies. Once complete, this infrastructure weaves across the landscape as prospectors search and drill holes to evaluate the location, depth, quality, and volume of exploitable coal resources, sometimes releasing the drilling waste straight into the environment. This exploration work fragments habitat, disrupts wildlife movement, contributes to soil erosion, and can introduce invasive species or sediment and other pollutants into the watershed and landscape. If the coal seams are deemed suitable and profitable to mine, the whole landscape can change. Further deforestation is required wherever coal will be extracted, along with the removal of topsoil layers to get down to rock. As entire ecosystems are lost, so too are their benefits. Overlying Alberta's coal deposits are foothills and Rocky Mountain forests, and they provide many important services, including oxygen production, carbon storage, water filtration, soil enrichment, temperature regulation, and flood mitigation, to name a few. Mining makes the area unsuitable for wildlife while operations are ongoing, forcing species elsewhere. This reflects losses in biodiversity, connectivity, and ecological integrity. While the topsoil is removed and stored in piles for future reclamation efforts, it is at risk of eroding and becoming a source of sedimentation in the surrounding watershed. Mountain soils are also notoriously slow to form, so any erosion here represents centuries of growth lost. Mines themselves have a considerable footprint on the landscape. In surface operations, which historically have made up about 20% of mines in Alberta, a number of techniques can be used to extract the coal, all of which are aptly named. Strip mining is done when ore is near the surface, but the contours of the mountains make other methods unfeasible. It removes the overburden in strips to expose the coal seams beneath. Open pit mining is an approach to extract reserves, covering expansive areas in places more accessible for mining equipment, creating large quarries where ore and waste rock is excavated. Mountaintop removal is as invasive as it sounds and involves blasting off whole peaks and summits to expose seams buried too deep for other techniques to reach. In my opinion, however, the distinctions are largely semantics, and they're being weaponized to mislead the public. Seeing mining within mountain ranges and near the tops of mountains is what folks have always been concerned about on this issue, regardless of the technical definitions. But more on this later. Underground mines make up the bulk of past operations in Alberta, and while they have a smaller footprint on the surface, they can increase ground instability and subsidence, change the overlying topography and drainage, introduce contaminants, and alter chemical, physical, and biological properties of the environment. They can impact water quality, exchange, and other hydrological processes, and pose health and safety risks. There are multiple types of underground mining, but the main one currently used here is called room and pillar. It's used at CST Coal's Grand Cache mine and is proposed for Summit Coal's Mine 14 project. I was unable to find photos within the Grand Cache mine to illustrate what room and pillar looks like, other than this unfortunate incident on the right, where a mine wall collapsed and partially buried a worker and their equipment pretty recently. Notably, while this incident was happening and while other incidents at this mine site were being investigated, the Alberta Energy Regulator was still approving new applications for this coal company. The overall environmental impact of a given mine is dependent on size, location, and duration of the operation, and its subsequent reclamation efforts. But ultimately, all types unearth byproducts alongside the coal that would otherwise be stored deep underground. This is where regional impacts emerge. Recent research has made clear that the impacts of coal mining operations are far from localized, even with adherence to current so-called best management practices. Now exposed to the atmosphere, elements, metals, and chemicals in the waste rock and process tailings can leach into the surrounding environment and are capable of impacting a pretty large area. Let's look to the Elk Valley for insight. I like this view a lot because it shows just how large the footprint is we're talking about. It can be really hard sometimes to grasp the size of these mines and how big they can actually get. But you can see here that the mines in the Elk River Valley do take up almost the entire river valley. Coal mines have operated here for over 120 years. There are 5 large metallurgical coal mines in the valley, with 4 currently in operation, all owned by Elk Valley River Operations, also known as EVR. EVR was once owned by Teck Resources, who recently sold the business to Glencore. EVR emphasizes on their website that workplace health and safety, operational excellence, and environmental responsibility are their top priorities, and that they are maintaining stringent safety standards, implementing best management practices, and researching new technology to protect the watershed. But multi-million-dollar fines are habitual for the company, which has a rampant record of noncompliance, including unauthorized waste spills, pollution breaches, and the delaying of required water treatment facilities. And the downstream communities bear the consequences of that. This research article found that 95% of the selenium, 76% of the nitrate, and 38% of the sulfate entering the Koocanusa, a reservoir shared between Canada and the US, was coming from the Elk River Valley, which itself has seen concentrations of these elements and compounds increase by 581, 784, and 120% respectively since the 70s and 80s when mining really began ramping up. In the aquatic ecosystem, increased concentrations of selenium are known to cause nutrient and food chain imbalances, interrupt species migration, cause reproductive deformities and failure, and the extirpation of species within the affected watershed. Nitrates are a contaminant of concern in aquatic ecosystems because of their ability to stimulate algae growth, which in turn depletes oxygen in the water body and impacts the quality of habitat and the species who can survive there. In terms of human health, nitrates convert to nitrites, which decreases the amount of oxygen your blood can carry. Sulfate is monitored because it can cause dehydration and gastrointestinal issues at high concentrations and is known to pose health risks to animals and other livestock. The researchers conclude that while surface water treatment operations are providing some reduction in concentrations of these solutes, they have not been sufficient to overcome the influence mine waste has on the watershed and to meet the US water quality standards. Another study detected selenium over 500 river kilometers downstream from its source coal mines, meaning these contaminants have the ability to travel, accumulate, and impact communities much farther than once understood. This distance means that the selenium risk posed by the coal mines impacts not just the Elk River, but also the ecosystems within the Kootenay and Columbia watersheds as well. The implications here are that any mines or proposed mines we have in Alberta will also release contaminants that will travel downstream, which means folks downstream should have a voice in how the watershed is managed because they are affected by it. Two papers from the Alberta government further demonstrate the large zone of influence from coal mining. Researchers found that coal dust emitted by mines in the Elk Valley was dispersed well beyond their mining footprint and had settled in otherwise pristine locations like Window Mountain Lake. In the lake, they detected cancer-causing compounds that had been transported in the coal dust and found that the concentrations of these compounds had increased 30-fold since the mines opened, present at levels comparable to water bodies impacted by the oil sands. In this next paper, they found that the fugitive coal dust carried downwind across the provincial border was traveling much further than just Window Mountain Lake, but also contaminating snowpack across a broad region along Alberta's eastern slopes, at some places more than 50 kilometers away from the source mines. Here, fugitive coal dust is both a source of air pollution while it is aloft on the wind, and a source of water pollution as the snowpack melts and drains into the rivers that folks rely on and get their drinking water from. A key takeaway here is that this is pollution Alberta can't control. It's impacting our landscape likely in many ways we haven't discovered yet because of decisions being made across the provincial border that we do not have a say in. It is the baseline pollution that must be acknowledged and considered when we make our own land use decisions here. Additionally, Alberta's own coal mines are very likely polluting downwind and downstream ecosystems in the same way. Both types of coal, thermal and metallurgical, release climate warming gases in the process of their use. Thermal to produce electricity, and met coal is used in one way to make steel. Genesee Generating Station, pictured on the left, was Alberta's last coal power plant and officially stopped burning thermal coal in June of 2024. Now Alberta's grid is completely coal-free. The number 7 blast furnace, pictured on the right and owned by one of Canada's largest steel producers, Algoma Steel, was permanently decommissioned just this January, transitioning them off of met coal dependence, and now they use electric arc furnaces. I highlight this to emphasize that coal is not this critical mineral its supporters profess it to be, and that the world can choose alternatives to its use. Not only can we choose alternatives, we must. All types of coal contribute to climate change. It is well established that fossil fuel production and use must decline to keep us within livable levels. And remember, it's not whether you can survive more extreme, frequent, and unpredictable climate conditions, it's if the food crops can. As the 14th largest producer of coal in the world, Canada has a role to play here. Back in 2015, research found the country must keep 82% of its 6.58 billion tons in remaining coal reserves unburned and underground before 2050 to meet our climate commitments. Since, Canada's extracted over 500 million more tons of coal, or 44% of the 45-year coal budget in a single decade. We are simply extracting coal at too fast a rate. Considering all those impacts, what is Alberta's role in all this? While the 1976 coal policy wasn't perfect, it effectively conserved large areas of important and sensitive ecosystems from development and greatly reduced the number of new mines on the landscape. One of its major flaws, however, was that although areas were restricted from certain types of mining, companies could still submit applications for coal leases in those areas. While not approvable, this led to a waitlist of lease applications just waiting for weaker policy. Their hopes were answered in 2020 when the Alberta government suddenly rescinded the 1976 coal policy, approving almost 190,000 hectares of coal leases in once heavily restricted zones. It would later be revealed that this change was preceded by many years of heavy industry lobbying, with the government since fighting in court against releasing the full details of their backroom discussions. One infamous instance that sticks with me is when Tanya Furr, now Minister of Arts, Culture, and the Status of Women in Alberta, but once Minister of Economic Development, Trade, and Tourism, wrote to the leadership at Valerie Resources, a hopeful metallurgical coal company behind two proposed mines in Alberta, that, quote, Alberta is open for business and do not hesitate to contact her if there's anything she can do to help in the completion of their mining project. Almost a half a year before the government said anything to the public about it. The rescission was immediately met with public outcry and backlash, and in the following months, the government was forced to reverse course, reinstate the 1976 coal policy, ban mountaintop removal, stop approving new coal leases, and pause many existing leases. But this is also where we start to see language and definitions being used to mislead the public. Here, folks are being told that Alberta will never allow mountaintop mining, but what they're not being told is that the government only considers full removal of the entire mountain peak to be considered mountaintop mining, and that the mines that the public has been vocally concerned about don't meet this definition. It's an empty promise. And despite the successful public pressure, much damage had already been done. While sale and approval of coal leases had ceased, exploration was allowed to continue for much longer, with new roads carving up once intact wilderness. Finally, and long overdue, public engagement was undertaken in 2021 with the establishment of the Coal Policy Committee. Almost 25,000 people participated in their initial survey, with more than 85% indicating that they were not at all confident that coal exploration and development in Alberta is regulated to ensure it is safe, efficient, orderly, and environmentally responsible. After 9 months of engagement, the committee released their key observations and recommendations. Their final reports reiterated that Albertans care about the effects of possible coal development and are very concerned about their waters and place a high value on the Eastern Slopes region. That they are worried about the regulatory process for coal activities and that and they feel that coal policies can be easily overridden when many thought these policies were legally binding. The engagement process confirmed that Albertans expect accountability, transparency, and meaningful consultation opportunities from government when it comes to resource development, particularly as it relates to the headwaters in the Eastern Slopes. The government ultimately accepted the committee's findings, including these 8 specific recommendations. The last 2 I highlight as they're particularly critical and they demonstrate a huge issue currently faced by Alberta. Areas that were mined in the past that no longer have an owner or anyone to hold responsible are liabilities on the landscape. They should not be left in their current states. They should be remediated, but currently the government does not have coherent plans on how they will address this issue. Similarly, Alberta doesn't hold companies accountable for reclaiming their exploratory work, so roads and drill pads scar public lands long after the companies are gone, and that is not something the public should accept. As a response to all this, in March of 2022, the former Minister of Energy, Sonia Savage, issues a ministerial order placing a moratorium on coal exploration and development in the Eastern Slopes until a new coal policy could be created. Nearly every company who wasn't already operating a mine was made to suspend their work indefinitely while new land use policies were supposedly being developed. Despite Sonia's claim here, however, they did not hear Albertans loud or clear enough because 4 advanced projects were inexplicably exempt from the pause and could continue pushing their applications through the Alberta Energy Regulators process. These include Benga Mining, or are now Northback Holdings' Grassy Mountain Project, Montum Resources, now known as Evolve Power's Tent Mountain Mine, Coalspur's Vista Thermal Mine Expansion, and Summit Coal Inc.'s Mine 14 project, which is owned by Valerie Resources. Something you will notice repeatedly throughout this presentation is that mining companies frequently change their names, maybe to distance themselves from incidents or other bad press, and are often owned by other companies who in turn have a parent company, which makes it all the more difficult to track exactly what is happening and who's responsible for which mine. We're going to fast forward through a couple of years where, because of the pause, the threat from coal mining was more in the background, present but not as immediate as it had been. Now we're in December of 2024, and as a parting gift just before the holiday break, Alberta's current Minister of Energy and Minerals, Brian Jean, announces the Coal Industry Modernization Initiative, also known as CIMI, which promised new policy to be developed through sole consultation with industry by the end of 2025. Brian said that, among other things, the policy will ban mountaintop removal, which had already supposedly been banned, as well as new open pit mines from the eastern slopes, and make best practices mandatory to prevent selenium from entering the waterways. Here again, we see some misleading statements by officials, as it comes to light that existing mines and those advanced projects, or at least Grassy Mountain, would be grandfathered in under old rules, and the ban on open pit mines would not apply to them. Lobbyist records also show coal companies already trying to loosen the definition of what constitutes an open pit mine. I highlight this quote from Brian in particular, as I think it's something we should be holding our government accountable to. Here, they promise that they will not risk our waters in any way, and that they will allow no further discharge of selenium into the watershed. That means we are being promised that the selenium concentration the government will tolerate in the release of coal wastewater is zero. That is what Brian said, and that's what we should demand. It does not matter that as of yet it has not been possible for mining companies to completely prevent selenium or other contaminants from entering the water. That's what he said repeatedly, and that is the limit that we should have enforced. It is also interesting that this is what the minister is saying, as it's not consistent with what industry is currently promising, and it's also inconsistent with what has been previously indicated to the federal government, who are currently drafting nationwide rules on the permissible levels of contaminants within coal tailings releases. The top screenshot shows information Northback is providing online about their Grassy Mountain project, where they say they will minimize the release of selenium. Critically, to minimize is not the same as to stop the release. The bottom quote is from the federal regulations currently in development, where they're already proposing to decrease the stringency of their own standards because industry in the provinces believe that meeting the more stringent standards is not possible. Notably, even the stringent standards they are proposing here is about 5 times higher than the recommended guidelines. That should raise alarm bells, as it means the governments at both the provincial and federal levels are willing to allow companies to pollute at levels they know are higher than acceptable simply because the mining companies cannot achieve better. As of February 2026, new coal policy has yet to arrive, which means it has been almost 4 full years since the Alberta government first promised it. Despite there being no new policy to guide the coal industry, a month after the CIMI announcement at the end of 2024, the minister unexpectedly ended the moratorium on coal exploration and development. With no formal declaration from government, this change was only revealed days later through an Alberta energy regulator bulletin shown on the left, which announced the AER had been directed to lift suspensions of all approvals, permits, licenses, and leases affected by the moratorium and extend their expiry dates. The map on the right shows where all the newly active coal leases are, many of which were first issued in that short period the 1976 coal policy was rescinded, and concentrated in sensitive and important areas in our eastern slopes. These leases are concentrated in the headwaters of the Smoky River, which flows into the Peace, the Athabasca, the North Saskatchewan, and the Oldman, which ultimately flows into the South Saskatchewan. Notably, many of these companies are suing the Alberta government for damages claimed to be incurred during the moratorium on coal mining and development. In defense of rescinding the moratorium, the Premier stated that they had to do it to protect taxpayers and that they were doing it to avoid lawsuits. Lawyers have previously pointed out that the provincial government had multiple legal avenues to avoid paying the claims. The coal companies continued with their lawsuits against the province even as the AER revived their past applications. 5 different companies and their subsidiaries put cases before the courts, demanding over $15 billion from the provincial coffers. 3 have since settled, but only 2 amounts are currently known. This information was not publicly released through official government channels, but instead discovered by reporters based on the company's own statements to their shareholders. Clearly, rescinding the moratorium did not protect taxpayers as the government had claimed. While this was all ongoing, there's 2 things to remember. Existing operations were allowed to continue during the moratorium period, and some areas have always been unrestricted from development. So while the government flip-flopped on policy for half a decade, a few applications were proceeding through the regulatory process as normal. Let's meet Alberta's coal mines. We're gonna do a south to north flyover and see the existing footprint coal already has here in Alberta. Starting with Tent Mountain. This is a great example of something I'd apparently be wrong to characterize as mountaintop removal, because even though a sizable chunk is gone, Tent Mountain hasn't been completely flattened. Montem Resources ultimately discontinued their project here, but not before first rebranding as Evolve Power, pitching a pumped hydro storage facility, fighting with the AER over the implementation of a selenium monitoring program, and suing the Alberta government for perceived damages. Montem was paid $95 million in a settlement with the government, but still retains their coal leases here. Last year, they were also slapped with an enforcement order under the Public Lands Act for undertaking numerous unauthorized activities, including the excavation of 2 borrow pits and infilling Crow's Nest Creek and a nearby floodplain. Now let's travel downstream to look at 2 relevant government studies. The first, published, reveals that well after the mines at Tent Mountain and Grassy had ceased operation, they continued to be a source of pollution, contributing to increased concentrations of sediment, selenium, iron, and other chemicals in the Crow's Nest watershed through runoff. The second study, still in preprint, found that these contaminants had entered the food chain. Fish collected from Crow's Nest Lake, a managed recreational fishery that contains brown, lake, and rainbow trout, along with mountain whitefish, were found to have concentrations of common mining pollutants above average in their muscle tissues when compared to other fisheries in Alberta. Of the 212 fish sampled, every single one was found to have concentrations of selenium in its muscle tissues well exceeding safety guidelines. Arsenic, barium, chromium, cobalt, manganese, molybdenum, nickel, thallium, and zinc were also above detection limits in some samples. The source of these pollutants was identified to be from drainage the lake receives from the legacy mine on Tent Mountain. The authors conclude that considering the existing stressors in the watershed, any new developments of coal mining along the eastern slopes may well push the Crow's Nest fishery beyond recovery. Now on to Grassy. Despite being jointly reviewed and rejected by the AER and Environment and Climate Change Canada in 2021, Grassy Mountain was labeled an advanced project during the 2022 moratorium announcement. Grassy Mountain's proponents reinvented themselves as Northback Holdings Corp. In 2023 and used their advanced project status to submit a new application for an exploration program on the same site. While their status as an advanced project was highly contested and even challenged in court before government decisions prematurely ended the proceeding, these applications were ultimately accepted for review by the AER and went through a public hearing process from December 2024 to March 2025. Although there were thousands of letters and emails and phone calls sent voicing concern, continuous protests, and numerous presentations throughout the hearing outlining the risks of permitting this project, in May of 2025, the AER approved Northback Holdings' applications for a coal exploration program, a deep drilling permit, and a temporary water diversion license on Grassy Mountain. The AER noted that in making their decision, any potential future coal mine and its impacts were considered outside the proceeding scope, despite Northback making clear this exploration program was a necessary precursor to eventually mining the site. Critically, Northback did not get approvals for a coal mine, and because of public pressure and concern, the exploration application approved had marked differences than what was originally submitted. Northback was forced to scale back their drilling efforts, reduce the number of boreholes on public lands, and remove new roads and drill pads from their original plans. This would have required further clear cuts and increased human footprint in the region. After completing their exploration program, Northback rounded out 2025, indicating their intentions to bring an application for a coal mine forward in the new year and began collecting public comments on their proposed terms of reference to inform the proposed mine's environmental impact assessment as directed by the AER. This is some of the exploration roads I'd shown earlier, part of the Elon Hard Coking Coal Project. These are Atrum Coal Limited's exploration roads from their Elon South location. Atrum is one of the 5 companies suing the government, and they recently settled out of court for $143 million. Here is another one of their projects where the exploration roads have been left. This shows that the exploration roads from the sudden removal of the 1976 coal policy still carve up the landscape today. Here are Cabin Ridge's exploration roads. They are another one of the 5 lawsuits against the provincial government. Now into Clearwater County and the headwaters of the North Saskatchewan River. Heavy lobbyists of the provincial government. Valerie is behind Black Eagle Mining Corp's Blackstone project here, and Summit Coal's Mine 14 project near Grand Cache, which we'll get to later. Valerie Resources is the last of the companies suing the government and has reportedly settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. Concerns are particularly high here because there's no established coal mines already in the area or major legacy disturbance, so this would be new ground breaking. Now on to examples of operating mines. Coal Valley Mine is a thermal coal mine owned by Coal Valley Resources, who in turn is owned by Westmoreland Mining, who was the company behind the lobbying push to loosen the definition of a coal pit mine, an open pit mine. Coal Valley Resources is also the owner of the Obed Mountain Mine, the site of the largest coal tailings spill in North America. On October 31st, 2013, an earthen berm broke on site, releasing 670 million liters of coal wastewater into Apetowon and Plant Creeks, which drain into the Athabasca River. They were fined $4.5 million for the incident, in part for violations under the Fisheries Act. In the resulting monitoring and research, it was found that the plume of wastewater released traveled approximately 1,100 kilometers downstream to the Peace Athabasca Delta over the time span of a month, and contained elevated concentrations of nitrogen, phosphorus, arsenic, lead, selenium, zinc, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which had physical and biological and chemical implications for the Athabasca River watershed. An important note here is that the severity of the incident was reduced because the dilution power of the Athabasca, but smaller watersheds with lower flows would have less resilience to something like this. Back to our operating thermal coal mines. In 2024, Environment and Climate Change Canada failed to designate Coalspur's Vista coal mine expansion under the Impact Assessment Act, despite Canada as a country co-founding the International Powering Past Coal Alliance and committing to banning all exports of thermal coal by 2030. Now, Canada's largest thermal coal mine is set to operate until at least 2036, extending the land, air, and watershed pollution experienced by Canadians from the open pit mine for another decade, and contributing to further climate warming carbon emissions long after the export ban was meant to be in effect. Now on to the coal branch for examples of what coal mine reclamation looks like in Alberta. Once vegetated, it will take decades before the forests and meadows return and have any semblance to what it was like here before. Notice the number of end-pit lakes that dot these 3 mines here. These are all quarries where coal was once excavated. You also see differences in topography, like these stepwise cliffs that were made from mining that look very different from the surrounding landscape. The end pit lakes here will likely have many of the same contaminant issues we see elsewhere, and that will become clear when I discuss some research in the following slides. Here, coal mining went on for decades, with the first mine, Luscar, opening in 1969. This is also where the government of Alberta first recognized that coal contaminants accumulating downstream of the mines would be an issue, with scientists finding selenium concentrations exceeding water quality guidelines already back in 1998. These three mines are now all in the process of being reclaimed, but recent research by the provincial scientists calls into question the efficacy of those reclamation efforts. The researchers observed that whether mine reclamation was nearly complete or in progress, pollutants persisted at elevated and harmful concentrations downstream, impairing the water quality in the McLeod River headwaters. Concentrations of 17 water quality parameters, including cobalt, nickel, sodium, manganese, antimony, chlorine, nitrate and nitrite, lead, selenium, vanadium, lithium, aluminum, arsenic, thallium, thorium, molybdenum, and turbidity were all at minimum 3 times higher of the mines, 3 times higher downstream of the mines in comparison to upstream conditions. I list all those water quality parameters as a reminder that while selenium is the main one we talk about in the media, and it's a useful one to show an example of how mining can contaminate the watershed, it is not the only contaminant of concern. There's many others that are associated with coal mining that also should be have very stringent regulations alongside them. The water quality parameters coal mine operators are required under the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act to reduce, coal mine operators are required under the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act to reduce concentrations of contaminants to pre-mining conditions and to levels that support aquatic ecosystems. Despite these requirements, the findings reveal that this is not being achieved. This reflects a failure in both the reclamation practices being used and the regulatory system meant to enforce them. Last but not least, the metallurgical coal mines. First up is the Grand Cache coal mine. It's a surface and underground operation owned by CST Canada Coal and has been plagued with incidents, including that mine wall collapse I showed earlier, but also a number of wastewater spills into the Smoky River because of failures of the tailings ponds, for which they have been fined just over $30,000. There is some interesting research here that has found there is significant and progressing ground deformation occurring where that mark is, which the researchers attribute as a likely result of the underground mining operations. And due to the deformation's location near the highway and river, they note that any potential failure here could result in a significant environmental impact. Nearby is the other location that Valerie Resources aspires to mine. It is the last of the advanced projects and the last mine I'll speak about today, Summit Coal Inc.'s Mine 14. One of the main worries here is the mine's water management plan, where I have that mark. They will have 2 waste and stormwater management ponds on the slope, and these will be periodically discharging right into Carconte Creek, which is highlighted on the map. And Carconte Creek drains directly into the source of Grand Cache's drinking water. In November of 2024, the AER decided that Summit's proposal to develop an underground metallurgical mine on Grand Mountain would, like Grassy, require a public hearing. The company had been adversarial to the regulatory process from the beginning, requesting the AER reverse decisions, dismiss concerns, expedite timelines, and limit the scope of public participation. When the AER repeatedly rejected these requests, Summit sent a letter to the Minister of Energy, accusing the regulator of delaying jobs in Grand Cache and construction of Mine 14 by holding a public hearing. The public hearing was set to occur in October of 2025. That is until the CEO of the AER, Rob Morgan, a former oil and gas executive, canceled the hearing outright in August of 2025, following a written request directly from Summit. Directly from Valerie Resources, Summit's parent company. Morgan's decision to do so was unprecedented and unilateral, and it set a troubling precedent whereby industry can sidestep public accountability by appealing directly to the CEO when dissatisfied with established regulatory procedures or panel decisions. A few months later, a series of emails are uncovered through a Freedom of Information request that reveal meetings discussing the public hearing took place between Morgan, Valerie Resources, and the Minister of Energy and Minerals office shortly before its cancellation. In reference to their request to Morgan to cancel the hearing, Valerie's reps were quoted saying, "It is the win-win-win for everyone." Alberta Wilderness Association and the Northern Alberta chapter of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society have since gotten permission to challenge the legality of the AER CEO's decision with the Alberta Court of Appeal, with court dates set for later in 2026. There's a couple of takeaways here. Thinking back to the size and scale of mines in the Elk Valley, Alberta really does not have the same concentration or footprint of mines here. Coal does not have the same foothold in Alberta as it does in BC. Let's just zoom out so we can see all of them in one. Which means we have an opportunity here to learn from BC. Do we continue opening up mines in these sensitive and important landscapes? Or do we recognize that the impact from our few existing operations and legacy disturbances have already passed the level of damage we should tolerate? I would be remiss to point out that as we traverse the slopes, coal was not the only land use impacting the region. Roads, forestry cut blocks, oil and gas infrastructure, and other land uses were present and are also impacting the ecological integrity of the foothills and Rockies. Do we add additional strain and stressors with these mines? Do we extend our already immense human footprint into some of the last relatively intact wild spaces? You may have heard that the eastern slopes are Alberta's water towers, and that is because almost all of our major rivers have their headwaters here. These are small streams, seeps, creeks, and other water bodies that gather water and converge and gather water and converge and do so a couple more times to eventually drain into these large rivers. And the snow and the precipitation that is captured in the foothills and Rockies forms the majority of the river flows that we rely on year round, particularly in southern Alberta. Is coal mining worth the risk of degrading and contaminating watersheds at their very start, knowing they must then flow hundreds and thousands of kilometers more to support everyone downstream? Because that is the choice Alberta's making. The 1976 coal policy is still in place. Or sorry, let's let's review the current state of coal policy in Alberta. The 1976 coal policy is still in place, but likely only until CME is complete. The government has stated that mountaintop and open pit mining are banned, but because the definitions are still unclear, we don't know which, if any, of the mines this will apply to, but clearly not projects like Grassy, which confirmed recently that they were applying to the regulator as an open pit mine. The pause on all exploration and development is over, and all leases have been reactivated, including those within previously restricted areas under the 1976 policy. This means that companies are free to submit mining applications to the regulator. However, it seems that many are waiting for CME to be complete before they do so, likely to have more certainty on what they can and can't do. Finally, the feds are still drafting the proposed coal mining effluent regulations, which would set release limits on contaminant concentrations in coal wastewater. These are severely overdue, and early indications show that these regulations will not be as stringent as necessary to protect the environment. This half-decade of sudden, perplexing, and unpopular changes to provincial coal policy means Albertans could see an influx of industry in the eastern slopes spread across the headwaters of the Athabasca, Peace, North and South Saskatchewan rivers, and upstream a third of the province's population, as well as towns and communities in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the Northwest Territories downstream. Concurrently, environmental incidents and pollution are frequent at existing operations. Liabilities from legacy mines and exploration roads are still unaddressed, and some coal companies are outright refusing to comply with authorities. Considering all the research highlighted today, coal industry's pollution problem persists from past projects, presents at existing operations, and can be expected in the future without drastic action. The problem is one that has, is, and will continue to impact Alberta's watersheds, airsheds, landscapes, and fisheries. Those same government scientists that are elucidating these new threats from coal are seeing their work suppressed and their outreach efforts muzzled by their own employers, the government. Regulators are proving toothless, ineffective, and potentially complicit in the harm caused by coal. Policies meant to protect the environment and the public are being further watered down at the behest of coal lobbies. The government is not listening to the people. Times are dire, but the fight continues, and that is where all you good folks come in.